This is Changing Denver, the show about our city, how we make it, and how it makes us. I'm Paul Caroli. Welcome back to Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats. A few days ago, I hosted a panel at the Denver Public Library with 3 historians who have each tackled the Rocky Flats story from unique angles. It went really well, and I'm excited to share the recording with you in a minute. But before that, though, I've got something to say. Thank you. That's it. Thank you. Thank you for listening and supporting this show for so long. We've been consistently putting out these sound-rich audio documentaries with reporting, analysis, and storytelling about all of Denver's most important people and places for almost 3 years. Can you believe it? From the grit of Colfax and the design of the Denver Zoo to more serious topics like gentrification in 5 Points and the KKK connection to the neighborhood at the site of the former airport. We've always tried to bring you new perspective on familiar places. This new Rocky Flats series is in many ways the culmination of all of that. It's a massive, sprawling story that we're telling over the course of our 4th season. It's been almost 2 years in the making, and we've got plenty of surprises in store for you. I can only speak for myself when I tell you it's the most ambitious project I've ever taken on. All of this is to say, Changing Denver has taken a lot of work. Brainpower, energy, time, money. It's always been a labor of love, but at a certain point, love just isn't enough. My life has changed a lot since I started making this show back in 2015. There are appealing podcast projects all around. I honestly don't know if I'm going to want to carve out the time to make any more episodes of Changing Denver after the Rocky Flats series. I need something to change the equation, some show of support from the community that this is needed. So today, in response to many calls from loyal listeners for a way to support the show, we're doing just that. If you open your browser right now and type in www.patreon.com/changingdenver, that's www.patreon.com/changingdenver, you'll be able to set up a monthly donation to the show, any amount you like. Every episode we make will always be free. This is not a paywall. But we want to give a little more to the people who give us a little more. So if you pledge at least $3 per month, we'll send you 3 Changing Denver stickers and the transcript of each episode in the Rocky Flats series as they are released. That includes the main episodes, but also the short supplemental pieces we're planning to deliver in the interim. If you're feeling especially supportive, you can pledge at the $10 per month level. If you do that, we'll thank you by name in the credits of each episode in the Rocky Flats series. And maybe some other stuff too. I really don't know. You never know what crazy idea will occur to me in a month. Also, if there's a Changing Denver reward that you'd like, let us know. We're open to anything. And just to be crystal clear, this is not some ongoing commitment. This is a limited run campaign. We're shutting it down after the Rocky Flats series concludes later this year. This is a 6 or possibly 7-month commitment to support Changing Denver, to recognize the value of our body of work, and to demonstrate to us that this is a podcast our city needs. That's it. At least $3 a month for transcripts and stickers, at least $10 for a shout out in the credits. www.patreon.com/changingdenver. There's nothing else to it. And now, on with the show. Hi all, I'm Paul. Welcome to Remembering Rocky Flats, a panel discussion on the history of the former nuclear weapons plant, which, as some of you may know, operated for about 40 years, about 16 miles west of Denver. So I am the podcaster in residence, and part of that program has been producing a season-long series all about Rocky Flats, the history, and eventually the recent controversy around safety concerns. So last week, the series started, put out a first episode all about the history, mostly the official narrative, and that was my attempt to tell a long and winding story. And it's not really my main focus for this broader series, so I invited our 3 panelists who have each approached this same story from different perspectives to offer a little bit more color to that narrative. And I don't know about you, but I'm eager to hear what they have to say. I'd also like to make clear before we go on, and for the purposes of our question and answer time later, that our focus today is not the lingering contamination and the health concerns at the site today. So if you have questions about that, this is really not the forum. We're really interested mostly in the history. But with no further ado, I'd like to thank my partners for this series, the Denver Public Library, of course, Denver Arts and Venues, and the Colorado Independent, which is publishing the series. Now, our panelists. Dorothy Charlo, to my immediate right. Dorothy is a PhD and retired clinical psychologist. In the late 90s and early 2000s, she worked with the Boulder Public Library's Maria Rogers Oral History Program to conduct more than 100 interviews with former workers, activists, politicians, and scientists, and contractors, some of which you heard in the first episode of our Rocky Flats series last week. Dorothy went on to publish a paper based on these interviews in the Journal of Peace Psychology. That paper is called Secrecy and Its Fallout at a Nuclear Weapons Plant, a study of Rocky Flats oral histories. And then to her right, Len Ackland. Len is an independent journalist and retired journalism professor. During his time as editor, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists won a National Magazine Award in 1987. He went on to serve as the founding director of the Center for Environmental Journalism at CU Boulder. Of particular interest today, he is the author of Making a Real Killing, Rocky Flats and the Nuclear West, which, in my opinion, is the definitive history of the plant. And then our final panelist, Murph Widowfield. Murph has the unique distinction among our panelists of having spent time working at Rocky Flats. He was a contractor, and like many other people who worked out there, Murph has remained involved in issues surrounding the site. He is currently the president of the board of the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum, a museum that you cannot physically visit, despite years of effort from Murph and the rest of the board. Our panel, everybody. So before we really get into the meat of this, I'd like for each of you to just briefly take a turn sharing the story of how you came to Rocky Flats, what you were doing at that time, when was it, and what the plant meant to you. Len, I think it'd be appropriate for you to start.
Okay. Well, the three of us are members of the Cold War nuclear arms race generation, duck and cover, and those sorts of things. So in the late 50s, I was in junior high, and I remember driving with my family down Coal Creek Canyon and said, what's that over there? What are those big buildings? Oh, it's a government facility. A few years later, I was a freshman at CU in 1962, and looking out of my window, my dorm window, toward Rocky Flats, listening to John Fitzgerald Kennedy tell us that Russians had put missiles in Cuba. So my question at that point was, do I quit school and join the Army? Not knowing, of course, that we would have all been vaporized long before had war actually occurred. And also not knowing that just a few miles to the south, Rocky Flats was building nuclear weapons of mass destruction that would have helped kill us all. Speed forward, I was a newspaper reporter at the Des Moines Register and then the Chicago Tribune. When I got, and this is late 1970s, had young kids and became very concerned about the nuclear arms race. What are we doing here? I had an opportunity in 1984 to then become editor of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists magazine, also based in Chicago. It was founded by physicists who built the first nuclear weapons, but this particular group of physicists were concerned about nuclear war, wanted to prevent it, and also wanted to demystify the technology so people would have an ability to understand not to leave nuclear weapons to the priesthood that was laying claim to it. After the kind of end of the 80s, the Cold War ended rather dramatically and abruptly for those of us who had been in it with the fall of the wall. I decided that I wanted to bring some closure to my work on nuclear weapons, and particularly I wanted to understand why, if we humans are so smart, have we developed devices capable of destroying our species? So I thought Rocky Flats would be a good place to come back, and finally I would have an opportunity to do research and understand what actually occurred at Rocky Flats. So that's how I started working on the book.
Great. Okay, Dorothy, you want to go next?
Okay. I was drawn to do the Rocky Flats work from two different perspectives, two different passions, you might say. My interest in and belief in the value of oral history, and my concern about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I was nearing retirement from my work as a clinical psychologist in the late 90s when I joined the Maria Rogers Oral History Program in Boulder, which is part of the Boulder Public Library. And it's based in the Carnegie Branch Library of Local History. And is professionally managed, and volunteers do the oral histories, and they're archived in the public library, and they're accessible to everybody. And that was very attractive to me. I felt my professional work had prepared me well to do interviewing and to listen deeply to people's experiences. I had also done a lot of reading of oral histories of the Holocaust, oral histories having to do with local affairs such as miners and people in difficult circumstances. And I really felt that oral histories could give both breadth and depth to historical events. And so as I was beginning to do oral histories with the program, Rocky Flats was in the news all the time with the discussions of it was going to be closed and discussions of the accidents and fires and leaks that had been there, and also some of the health problems that people were having. And I began to be intrigued with trying to get the human story of Rocky Flats. It seemed to me that although we had heard from a lot of the activists, we really hadn't been able to hear the stories of the workers. And it felt to me like that was an important part of the history that should be documented. So I felt like I was curious about what it was like to work in this factory and what it was like. Were the workers thinking about what they were doing in terms of making this key piece of a nuclear weapon? And I was also concerned that perhaps they wouldn't want to talk with me because of security concerns or whatever. So the first person I was able to interview was a retired Rocky Flats worker, a lovely man, who was a frequent client of the library, and that's how I managed to get hold of him. He assured me that the workers knew full well what they could talk about, what information was classified and what wasn't. And he explained that, it was the size and shapes of the weapons, and that he felt that Rocky Flats workers would be interested in talking to me since their stories had not been told. So he gave me names, and I began to interview different workers. I found that I began to understand why people did work there. They were drawn to the plant because of good wages and excellent career benefits. And many of the workers had started out working as like a janitor and had worked their way up to being personnel managers. And it was clearly a place that had offered a lot of opportunity. And of course, it was federally funded, so there was plenty of resources. And the workers there felt that they were select because they had to pass security clearance. And they also felt patriotic working there. They also, I realized, often didn't really have a clear impression of exactly what the final product that they were doing, because they never saw that. The majority of them, maybe a few did, but that key component that was the key part of the nuclear weapon that was made there wasn't something that they saw much of. So the enormity of the history of the plant was beginning to dawn on me, and I realized that the different workers at the plant often had very different perceptions because they worked in different parts of the plant, and because of the security restrictions, they couldn't move easily from one part of the plant to another, and many of them didn't know what was going on in the cold side versus the hot side. And I might say hot and cold refers to hot meaning radioactive, dealing with radioactive materials, whereas the cold side was not that. Anyway, I certainly got the impression that many of the workers were eager to tell their story, and it wasn't difficult to find people who wanted to talk with me. Then in 2003, I was invited to meet with the group planning for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum. And they were, I talked with them about what I was doing with oral histories, and they were quite interested, because one of the reasons they were interested is because in planning a museum, the things that you would think of as being artifacts from this Rocky Flats couldn't be a part of a museum because they were contaminated. So they were quite interested in getting on board with an oral history program. And so we were able to get a grant written and funded by the Colorado Historical Museum to fund interviews with workers and others that would delineate the buildings that were at Rocky Flats, since the buildings were all going to be torn down, all 800 of them. So the museum hired a skilled oral historian, Hannah Nordhaus, and together she and I interviewed more than 90 persons because of this grant. And I might say at this point, the manager of the Maria Rogers program, Susan Becker, became deeply involved in facilitating the collaboration between the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum and the Boulder Public Library, the Maria Rogers program. And she was able to make sure that the interviews were properly archived in the Boulder Library and available online and accessible. And so then we formed a committee of museum folks and oral history folks, and we expanded the collection of the oral histories to include people like EPA regulators, Environmental Protection Agency regulators, people from the Colorado State Health Department, politicians, peace activists, community safety activists, environmental activists, and others that were really deeply involved in Rocky Flats. And one of the things that just continued to impress me was how much volunteer time was put into the whole subject of Rocky Flats. Many people became sort of experts in the arcane technicalities of Rocky Flats. I had initially I'd felt that there were, two groups. There was us, the activists, and them, the workers. And after doing many of these interviews, I realized that there was no us and them, but there were a huge variety of experiences and perspectives and opinions that formed the whole of this unique history. And I think I should stop there.
Yeah, I think that's a good place. Murph, that would leave just you. I mean, so how'd you come to Rocky Flats?
I always like being last. My background, I am not a Colorado original. My wife will not allow me to be. I moved here when I was 11 years old and had traveled all over the East Coast during the Second World War. I was just old enough during that time to be able to go to the movies and see all the newsreels and what was happening in Europe and what was happening all over. And we lived in southern New Jersey and about 3 houses from the beach. And during the wintertime, there was no one, just my mother and I. During the summertime, it was an area of 50,000 people, and it was very crowded. But Mom and I were down on the beach one day, and Mom looked out in the ocean, just daydreaming, trying to figure out where Dad was. He was in the Navy. And all of a sudden she said to me, "Murph, what is that little square thing out there in the water?" And I looked, I couldn't see anything. Finally, she got me to see what it was. I said, "Well, Mom, that's the conning tower on a submarine." She said, oh, run up to the house and get me my binoculars. So I did. Brought them down to her. She sat and looked for a minute, laid down the binoculars, and started running toward the house. So I picked up the binoculars and looked. Yeah, it was the conning tower on a submarine with the most beautiful iron cross on the side of that conning tower you ever want to see. We were the first city north of the entrance to Norfolk Navy Base, and of course all of the harbor facilities, and we used to see ships burning. Well, come time for me to go into the military, why, I chose the Army, much to my father, my uncles, my aunts, everybody's chagrin, because they were all Navy. On the other hand, the Army would let me fly, and the Navy would not. But I spent 3 years in Europe on the West German, Czechoslovakia, and East German border. And I watched the Russians and what they were doing. For instance, we had to fly into Berlin when they first started to build the wall to pick up the military courier, to bring him out and take him down to Stuttgart so that he could inform 7th Army what was happening with the Russian military. But they would do everything in the world to try to find out who we were, what we were doing, and what our arms were, and trying to keep up with us. And I have no doubt in my mind that if it had not been for the United States military in Europe, the Russians would have taken all of Europe. The French were about to vote in a communist government. The Italians already had. The Greeks were fighting against the communists. It was happening. And a lot of the German people who worked with us on the military base, there was only 400 of us that were American military. 1,600 German civilians took care of the base for us. We were all talking all the time about what the Russians were and what was happening. When I came home, my dad had already been working out at Rocky Flats a little bit as an electrical engineer, mainly because he had a Navy security clearance. He did not have a Q clearance and could not go into a lot of the spaces, but he designed a lot of the electrical that went into those spaces. I did my first job out at Rocky Flats as a contractor, working on one of the boilers in Building 43. 43, it's now 443, but it was 43 at the time. And about every year after that time, why, I was out there as a contractor working on different items in different buildings for it. I've been a heavy industrial contractor all my life. I worked with a lot of military bases, a lot of arsenals, a lot of, like Rocky Mountain Arsenal. I worked with Rocky Flats. I worked with, in the uranium industry, during the manufacturing of uranium oxide. We built and maintained the uranium oxide furnaces for the uranium to be put into 55-gallon drums and shipped off to either Oak Ridge or Hanford or one of those places for further processing. I became interested in the Rocky Flats picture when I saw an ad in the paper. They were looking for an individual to serve on the Rocky Flats Stewardship Council. And I decided, what the heck, I'm retired at this point, I have nothing better to do, I'll go and apply. So with my background and everything, why, they decided that maybe I might make a good council member, so I was voted onto the council. About 2 years later, why, one of the groups, which was the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum, asked me if I would please come and join their board. And so I have been on the board of Rocky Flats Cold War Museum, which is in storage, by the way. We don't have a museum because we have no money. At any rate, so I have been on that board now, and they decided that I ought to be the president, and so I've been the president for a couple of years now. But we're trying to raise the money. We wish to have a museum. We are the only nuclear facility that I know of in the United States that the Department of Energy has not either fully or partially funded a museum. And the reason is because Rocky Flats was probably one of the most protested sites in the United States. And we had a few of those protesters on our board of directors, trying to show both sides and all sides of the story. And that made DOE a little unhappy, and they have never in the past decided to support us. So that's where we are. Everything is in storage, part of it in a storage locker, part of it in my shop, and I want my shop back so bad I can taste it. But at any rate, the rest of it is in other storage and stuff like that.
Murph, let me jump in here.
We would like to have a museum, and we're fighting to get one right now. Yes, sir.
I got a follow-up for you right on that last point. What is in storage? Like, someone asked me the other day when I told them who would be on the panel, I said,
Sure.
you know, Murph's the president of this museum that doesn't exist, and it's this Rocky Flats place, and they asked, like, what would even be there? So,
all of the materials and equipment that we have in storage are from non-contaminated areas outside of the plant, many of them. For instance, we have about 4 or 5 glove boxes. These things weigh about 5,000 pounds each. And they're made out of stainless steel. Some of them are lead lined. They are all production type equipment. They were all used in training areas to train the people how to use the glove boxes and what to do with the materials in the glove boxes. So those all those training materials were benign. There was no contamination in them. So all of our stuff, none of it was ever used in production. We do have a lot of other equipment that was used in the Rocky Flats plant area, but always on the cold side. None of it was ever a part of the hot or the contaminated portions. A lot of our materials are records and papers, photographs, things of that nature. There were well over 1 million photographs taken. 99% of those photographs were taken by the on-site photographer or photographers. They were Q cleared just like the workers were, and their job was to photograph and historically note everything that was there. Well, we have a lot of those photographs and have access to all of them. Paperwork. For instance, we have the copies of the original top secret booklets that were used to determine where the plant site should be. And this was all done by the Austin Company. Dow Chemical was hired to operate the plant, but the Austin Company was hired to make the location of the plant. There were 7 sites around the Denver area. Denver was decided, out of 7 states, was decided to be the final site because of the dry atmosphere, because of the remoteness and yet the closeness. They needed to be close to educated people or people where they could get into education departments and get them the proper education. And as Paul said, or I'm sorry, as Dorothy said, a lot of these people started off as farmers, coal miners, people who were not well educated, but the job paid well, and they were very interested in it. And the good thing that I can say about Dow Chemical was that they would back and help to finance education programs if these people would like to take educational programs in the evenings, and a lot of them did. A lot of them came out with degrees in chemistry and all kinds of areas. They picked up machinists and then had to retrain them. They picked up welders and then had to retrain them. Everything had to be done on site, and once that person was cleared with a Q clearance or a top secret clearance, then that person was pretty well tried to keep that person on site because they didn't want any of the secrecy to get out. My last
Murph, I think we're getting a little bit away from ourselves here.
Okay, my last statement is secrecy. If I tell Len a secret, you will all sit and wonder what I told Len.
I'll tell you.
But at any rate, the thoughts that go through your head are your own thoughts as to what I could have told him. And that constitutes the rumor. And there were more rumors flying around outside the plant and inside the plant. Because if I were working on this part of the glove box and when I finished, I passed it on to Len, Len could not tell me what he did with that product. And therefore, the rumor is there. And rumor is a big thing, and I just want everybody to understand the word rumor.
Okay. And we'll touch on secrecy a bit more later, but Len, I've got a question for you. I mean, Murph talked about the struggle of balancing the story of the plant between the activists and DOE and the people who are working inside. Your book is so carefully researched and comprehensive. Like, did you struggle with that question? Which to emphasize?
No, I didn't struggle with that question because, you know, as a journalist, you know, when you start doing research, there are three areas that you look at, right? You have documents, so what's the documentary history? You have people, so you have interviews, and you have observation. So, you know, those three together, you know, on the people side, you know, one of the most fascinating things about Rocky Flats were all the different communities and sub-communities that were involved. So, you know, my goal was to interview basically anybody I could find who had knowledge of or some relationship to the plant. So workers, managers, important to make a distinction there, you know, the community, ranchers, a lot of ranchers, and, you know, in 1951, when Rocky Flats was first announced, big headline, Denver Post, you know, Denver, AEC to build $45 million plant. I mean, hooray. Oh, and the little slug line above it was, there's good news today. So, you know, when you think about all of the protests that followed over the decades, remember, that was good news when it came because it meant jobs. So for me, you know, I don't know if you want me to start off with a little bit of the methodology on
Sure.
this, about how
Sure.
you do it. So you know, it was important to have from the start, you know, a chronology. So I built a chronology. And then I needed to find out, okay, so where are the documents that enable you to get to that? One of my first trips was to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and they have, so I had already built a pretty extensive chronology of, you know, major events that I knew about. So I went to the archives to try to find documents that would give me insight into what happened. So the documents at the National Archives, typically, when you go in there is a document, it's a finder's key, right? So it tells you where you, we're going to have questions later, so I think if you could hold your question, that would probably be.
Yeah, we'll have time at the end.
So the finder's key on Rocky Flats would have helped me locate documents that I needed to look at. Well, guess what? The finder's key was classified. So I couldn't even know what I couldn't see. So what I did was, you know, try to figure out, okay, And here are some documents around, 1955, what happened there, and it was not a really good search. I also was able to find documents at the plant site, some of which were in files that had been contaminated, so I had to, request to get into their document room, and I spent weeks, going through those documents. But, you have to tell a story with more than documents. So there were the people, and one of the families that still you see their name every time you drive down 36, the Church family, Church Ranch Boulevard. So at that time, Marcus Church was the main, kind of the leader of the family. But he had died by the time I got here to do the research in the 90s. But his nephew, Charlie McKay, I identified, and it took me, I think about a year before I finally wrote him a letter asking for an interview, because there's certain people, when you do a story, you've got to talk to these people, and if they say no, that's not a good thing. So I wrote in this letter explaining who I was doing a history, and he said, well, in 3 weeks I can give you an hour. So I went, and it turned out that I had a son who's in construction, so we started talking about construction. So 3 hours later, I left. He had agreed to let me have access to his uncle's files, his personal files, his letters and documents, and that was a treasure trove for me. So, as I went into the story, and along the way, then the activists come in, and I, interviewed the activists and workers, and early on, and I'll close up with this. Early on, I realized that in order to understand what Rocky Flats actually manufactured, and they manufactured bombs, they didn't manufacture triggers, which is the great euphemism about Rocky Flats, but we can get to that in a while. I needed to understand two things really well. I needed to understand the physics, so how did the explosions happen? And I needed to know the health issues, the radiation. And so I spent a lot of time in the first couple of years. I spent 9 years researching the book while I was also teaching. It was very important to have the grounding, the science grounding, so I could do interviews that made sense to me and would also then hopefully make sense to readers. So I spent a lot of time doing that before, along with getting into the rest of the story.
You mentioned Marcus Church's files. There's one tidbit in your book that I think you got from those files about the cows in the plant. Yeah. Could you just briefly retell that story? Right. I think people are going to appreciate it.
Right. So when Dow Chemical came in, the first thing that happened, so this was private land. Well, in the United States, the way private land gets taken by the government is under the Fifth Amendment, under public need for land. So essentially, the government confiscated land for the site, and they did it in two different sections. The first one, I think, was 400 acres they needed for the core plant, and then later it was 4 square miles, and then it was expanded to 10 square miles in the 70s. So the land was owned by ranchers. About half of the land that the government wanted was owned by the Church family. And Marcus Church was a rancher and also a developer. I mean, he had great ideas of what he was going to do with his land. But once the government, Dow Chemical, started building the plant, they built a fence that cut off Marcus Church from 2 of his pastures. So instead of just running his cattle from one pasture to the other, like he always did, he had to go around the fence line, and that really pissed him off, So, and he complained to a guy named Cornelison, who was the security head of Dow Chemical. So I was interviewing Cornelison one day, and I asked him about, kind of his relations with church. And he said, yeah, he said, church was always, griping about, his cattle. So one day, one of my colleagues and I went to his house, knocked on the door and said, all right, we want to talk to you about your cattle. Okay. And he said, and so we reached a deal where we cut a gate in the fence, 2 gates, and gave him the keys so he could run his cattle across the plant from one pasture to another in exchange for putting monitoring devices on his land. And then he said, this is Cornelius, he said, of course, we didn't tell Washington about it because they wouldn't have understood. And he only did it a couple times.
Just a mind-boggling story, imagining cows walking through a nuclear weapons plant.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, so Dorothy, here's something I've wanted to ask you for a long time, and I hope this question gets to a broader question about, like, what's the difference between an oral history and just a regular interview? So let's just say that someone was making a podcast series about Rocky Flats, and they'd done 30-plus interviews for this series. Would the Maria Rogers Oral History Program be interested in adding those to the archive? Would they fit?
Absolutely, and the current manager of the program is right here, Sins Nelson, and I'm sure she would be quite interested in talking with you about that.
Okay. All right, maybe we'll talk about that afterwards, all right? Okay, so Murph, you touched on the big question of secrecy. I'd like each of us to weigh in here, but so you discussed it a little bit earlier. Working at the plant, what did that feel like? What did that mean, maintaining secrecy? How did that affect your job, your life?
Well, you have to understand the plant just a little bit, because that plant was a city of itself. It had its own security department, or police department, if you want to call it that, but it was basically a militarily trained security department. It also had its own fire department, because you cannot bring in outside firemen if they are not security cleared for what you're doing. So they had a large fire department. They had their own medical. They had their own small medical clinic with a small hospital capability. They had direct connections to Lutheran Hospital, St. Anthony's Hospital, Denver General, University of Colorado Hospital. They had their own ambulance services. They had their own sanitation system. They had their own water purification system. There was no water underneath Rocky Flats. It's on a mesa, and it is a dry area. So they had to make arrangements, and they bought all of their water from Denver as a raw water, which is stored at the Ralston Reservoir. And they had a pump house, and they had a water pipeline that ran from Ralston Reservoir out to the plant. Everything was kept in-house, and therefore they could all keep everything under total secrecy. Some of the workers, when you would ask them, especially when Dow Chemical was out there, what they did, what does that plant do? They make scrubbing bubbles. And people just did not know or understand what the plant was. They talk about triggers. Well, the triggering device is actually the central part of the bomb. As Len said, you can call it a trigger. They call it a pit sometimes. They call it a core sometimes. But what it is the central part of the nuclear weapon. There are 2 different types of nuclear weapons. The first is the weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima. And that was a uranium weapon. It was a purified uranium. And what it had was 2 balls of uranium in it with explosives behind it. And when it hit the right altitude, the explosives went off, drove those 2 pieces of uranium together, which created a nuclear bomb. The bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was called the Fat Man. Oh, by the way, the one on Hiroshima was the little boy. The bomb on Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb, and it used a plutonium central core with high explosives all around it. And those high explosives, when they exploded, drove into that plutonium core, compressing it and tightening it up until it created its own explosion. Now, all of this happens within 1,000th of a second. It's not something that it's going to take a minute for us to see happen. But that was the difference in those two bombs. We pretty much quit building a lot of the uranium-type bombs because they're a little bit harder to handle, when you're loading them onto an airplane, when you're shipping them, and that type of thing. Because the plutonium bomb is strictly electronically detonated. But at any rate, the secrecy. When you went home from work, you could not tell your wife what you did. She could know where you work, but she could not know what you did. Not even a little bit. What'd you have for lunch today, honey? Well, I don't know, probably a bologna sandwich. Yeah, it was all bologna. But at any rate, the whole thing, the secrecy, was 100% maintained. And the only thing that really destroyed part of that secrecy was the 1969 fire. On Mother's Day of 1969, they released a lot of that information as to what happened to the news. And the Denver Post printed up a big story on it. And that's when the secrecy began to break down a little bit. Not a lot. It was still there. But it did begin to break down a little bit. But that's how the secrecy operated.
Thanks so much, Murph. Dorothy, yeah, let's hear from you. You made a number of observations in your paper that I mentioned earlier, so you want to...
I might just, since he's brought that up, I thought I might just read a little clip about the 69 fire from one of the workers, Bob DeGrazio. He was a Rocky Flats chemist. He said, oh, it was horrible, really bad for everybody because the fire was so intense and so hot that it had the big glove boxes just melt, just like butter, just melt. Not only that, but all those glove boxes contained plutonium or uranium, which was highly radioactive. And everybody held their breath because if it breached the ceiling, everything would go east. Broomfield would be wiped out. Denver. Oh, the 69 fire. It'll go down in infamy, in history, as almost the end of Colorado. And he was one of the few workers that gave a really complete and compelling picture in just a very short time. He also said something that I thought was very poignant. He said, the firemen, boy, they exposed themselves in a bad way to contain the fire and prevent it from breaching the ceiling. Nobody knows that because of the secrecy. Nobody knows that. Who appreciates that? Nobody. That was really poignant to me. I also, could I read one more quote about working, what it was like to work when you couldn't tell your family what was going on? I could never tell my family when something blew up or caught fire. You know, at times I'd go home with bandages on me and they'd say, what happened? I'd say, oh, I just got hurt. In truth, when you get contamination in a wound, they would take a toothbrush and Clorox and they'd pour the Clorox on the wound and scrub it with the toothbrush. And sweat would come all over your face. He laughs. And then they would check it again, and if they didn't get it, they would surgically remove that portion of the skin and keep removing pieces of the skin until they no longer picked up any contamination. Then they would bandage you up and send you home. You wouldn't be allowed to go back into the area for maybe a week until it started healing.
Wow. That's really something.
Can I say something about secrecy?
Yeah, I was going to come to you next, actually. Oh. So, Len, let me put it this way here. When we sat down for an interview a couple months ago, you said there was this one phrase you said to me, and I circled it a bunch of times in my notes, so I made sure to catch it. And the phrase was, secrecy breeds unaccountability. Now, what did you mean by that?
Yeah. Okay, so secrecy. Secrecy, we have issues with all across the board. Many of the government secrets and secret documents are not secret because they are dangerous to let out. They're secret for political reasons. So there's an overclassification going on in the classified system. However, there are real secrets, and the real secrets at Rocky Flats and any nuclear weapons plant has to do particularly with the shape of the weapon, which for a long time the plutonium core. Rocky Flats manufactured plutonium bombs. In 1952, the United States tested, and Murph explained the fission bombs. So there are uranium fission bombs and plutonium fission bombs. In 1952, the United States, for the first time, tested a fusion bomb, which is, instead of splitting the atoms are brought together, hydrogen atoms and deuterium, right? And that creates an explosion that is on the order of 1,000 times more powerful than a fission bomb. And the plutonium bombs at Rocky Flats were used to detonate the fusion bombs or trigger them. And that's where somebody, and I could never identify who came up with this great euphemism, oh, Rocky Flats just made nuclear triggers. Because you have this sort of image of, oh, yeah, little, handgun trigger. Okay, so in the secrecy at Rocky Flats, there came a big conflict over secrecy starting in about 1970. So 1969 was the fire, the Mother's Day fire. 7,000 pounds of plutonium were in that building. And one of the top Atomic Energy Commission officials reported to Congress the following year that if the fire had been a little bigger, hundreds of square miles would have been contaminated. We would have had a situation like around Pripyat in Ukraine, the Chernobyl plant. It wouldn't have been the same cause because Rocky Flats wasn't a reactor. Chernobyl was a reactor. Anyway, so in 1970, what happened in 1970? Well, guess what? The EPA was founded, the Environmental Protection Agency, because the country was finally, after Rachel Carson's book in 1962, was very concerned about what was going on with the environment. So suddenly, the Rocky Flats and other nuclear weapons facilities were subject to visits from EPA officials, but the weapons plants, including Rocky Flats, said, no, we don't have to abide by any rules other than the Atomic Secrets Act, Atomic Energy Acts of 1946 and 1952. I think it was the second one, or 54. Anyway, so you have no jurisdiction over us. So without jurisdiction, what was happening on the plant site, and workers knew about it, stuff was getting dumped. There were so many dump sites, dozens of dumping areas around the plant, because the main thing, the sole purpose, the priority for Rocky Flats was processing plutonium and manufacturing nuclear weapons. Everything else was in the way. So I have quotes from some of the managers saying, we just had to get the stuff out of, if there was any waste, we just had to move it out of the road. Before, a lot of it was shipped off to Idaho, to the dump facility up there, and then eventually a lot of the Rocky Flats waste was shipped down to the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico, Carlsbad. So if you feel like, okay, we are under the Atomic Energy Act, therefore no one can look at us, all kinds of behavior takes place that otherwise wouldn't happen. One of the most, it wasn't very dramatic, but it was kind of understandable, is that in the 1970s, a whistleblower revealed to a Denver Post, or Boulder Daily Camera reporter, that in the model shop at Rocky Flats, where models of weapons were built out of, gold and platinum and, very, other precious metals as well as fine wood, that the model shop was building staircases and massagers that they were giving as gifts to some of the, at that time it had already turned into the Department of Energy officials. I mean, it was a big scandal when the story broke, in the camera, saying that, my God, what are they doing there? With, they're using their secrecy to build goodies for officials. So that's what I mean by unaccountability with secrecy. And as Dorothy mentioned earlier, when I started interviewing workers, and I usually would try to do it at the Union Hall. And so that's where I made the first contacts, because that's safe territory, right? And I was particularly interested early on in beryllium disease, because berylliosis, chronic beryllium disease, is one of the diseases that you can pin directly on Rocky Flats. There are lots of controversies over cancers, even though there have been worker studies about that. But the beryllium, and beryllium is a heavy metal that was used as a tamper inside the weapon. And the dust from beryllium causes a lung disease similar to black lung disease or asbestosis. It's incurable. And hundreds of Rocky Flats workers have contracted chronic beryllium disease. I don't have the up-to-date figures about how many have died of that, but many have. Anyway, what I discovered when I started interviewing, I made a good contact with one of the union stewards who worked in the beryllium site, and so he would, sit in with, I remember one case where there were two workers and him in the room, and I would ask a question about their work, and they would look to I.K. Roberts was his name. They would look to I.K. and say, "Can we tell him that?" Yeah, and he was great. So, secrecy is part of what happened, but there was also a different aspect of secrecy when you think about kind of the society, and Murph alluded to this. So there were 4 major production facilities, at Rocky Flats, scattered in different places. And the building that became most infamous was Building 771, which was the plutonium building, plutonium processing. And in particular, in that building, they couldn't talk to anyone who didn't work in that building about any of their work. So not only did you have secrecy from wives and husbands, but you had secrecy from your fellow workers because they didn't have the clearance to know what you were doing with the plutonium. So it got to be, it was almost like a fraternity, sorority situation where people who worked in those particular units felt very close to one another.
Can I just read a quote here? One guy who was a classifier of protected information at Rocky Flats, and he became a whistleblower, he said the following: "Because it was so compartmentalized," and that's what the term was called, compartmentalization, "there'd be little emergencies throughout the facility that very few people would know about. I wouldn't say that it was an active cover-up. I would just say that because there wasn't information exchanged freely and openly, which was prohibited, not everybody knew what was going on. So information protection can be a double-edged sword. It's great protection for national security, but maybe the people that are walking into that area need to know what they're walking into." One more quote. One of the physicists at Rocky Flats said, once the doors were opened, and that's when he meant later on after the fire and around the time of the FBI raid, once the door was open, what was really odd was that I found myself in a position of knowing more about the operations of the plant than the actual people who worked there. Excuse me, this is not a worker. It's an EPA, Nat Mueller, the EPA person that was going into the plant. He said, I knew more about the plant than the actual people who worked there because of compartmentalization. So someone right next door to another person wouldn't even know about the waste streams coming into them from that process.
Okay, great. All right, so one last question. I want to take all these things we've been talking about secrecy, and maybe apply some of these lessons to another example that our audience would be pretty familiar with, I think. So back in 1951, as some of you discussed, the U.S. government was expanding its nuclear weapons industrial complex, plopping down these plants all over, and they were huge wins for those local communities because of all the money and all the jobs that they brought with them. So a couple months ago, Amazon, a highly secretive company, started a highly secret process to choose a location for its second headquarters, and Denver is in the running. So what can we bring from the Rocky Flats story to this other similar in some ways example?
Let's hope they don't make nuclear weapons.
I think that might be it, right? I hope so too. All right, thanks so much for everybody for coming, and thanks to all of our panelists, Murph, Len, Dorothy. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks so much to Dorothy Charlo, Murph Widowfield, Len Ackland, and all of you that came out to the panel. Remember, if you care about the show and you want it to continue, go to www.patreon.com/changingdenver and set up a monthly pledge. Changing Denver is a proud member of the Denver Podcast Network. In the shadow of the mountains, we speak. Special thanks this week to Len Ackland, Dorothy Charlo, Murph Widowfield, Jenny LaPerriere, who helped put the panel together, and everyone else at the Denver Public Library. Our theme song is Minnow by Felix Fast Forward. See you in a few weeks for Chapter 2 of Unclear Danger, the Colorado story of Rocky Flats. Until then, I'm your host, Paul Caroli.
Coming to you from the X-Axis, it's John of All Trades with your host, John X.
Welcome to this John of All Trades podcast promo. Each Wednesday, I bring you a brand new interview with someone fascinating and ask the question we all ask when we meet someone new. Hey, what do you do? It's fun, informative, and it's the 2017 Westward Reader's Choice Award winner for Best Denver Podcast. iTunes, Stitcher, and johnofalltrades.us.